5 minutes now.
Hello, good afternoon and good day to everyone. I hope everyone can hear me well. My name is Juki. I'm the ED of CARI. We're most delighted to welcome all of you to today's webinar, How Can ASEAN Bounce Back? An EU Perspective, with our senior fellow, Mr. Paolo Vergano, who is joining us from Italy. Paolo is a key expert for trade facilitation in the Irritants project of ASEAN regional integration supported by the EU. He's been involved in the establishment and the operationalization of the ASEAN Trade Repository, ATR, and the ASEAN Solutions to Services, Investment and Trade, ASSIST. Now, two important trade facilitation instruments developed with the support by the EU through the ARISE and ARISE Plus programs, which are aimed at enabling the private sector to achieve increased regulatory transparency and address trade irritants within ASEAN, particularly with respect to the NTMs and NTBs. Now, before we start, if I may, I would like to also inform you that we have another very important CARI Briefings next week on July the 3rd from 3 to 4 p.m. Please save the date. We will have the privilege to have the Secretary General of ASEAN, His Excellency Datuk Lim Jock Hoi, to spend some time with us to discuss how ASEAN can bounce back as well. So please block your calendar and reserve your spot. You can go to the link via the QR code that I believe that was shown to you earlier. Otherwise, you can also go to the link that we'll provide in the chat box later on. Now, a few reminders before we start. Kindly ensure that all your mics are turned off during the webinar. And please raise any questions that you may have in the Q&A box so that Paolo can address them later on. Now, if you would like to speak, however, please indicate to us. My colleague will turn on your mic when it comes to the Q&A session. So with that, I would like to invite Tan Sri Munir, our chairman, to take over the session. Tan Sri, please.
Right, thank you, Joki. Can I add my words of welcome, everyone, wherever you may be, to this CARI post-COVID economic recovery plan dialogue. This is the second in our series that we are holding to see how ASEAN can bounce back. Some of you may recall last week we had Pauline Long to talk about how ASEAN can bounce back, but from a China perspective. This time we're going to have it from an EU perspective. If you recall, what Pauline said about ASEAN, whether it can bounce back, were two things that stood out to me. First, that ASEAN is in a sweet spot. Okay? Second, that ASEAN sells itself short. Now, this morning, I was in a virtual discussion with some Japanese businessmen, and they said the same thing, although they used more polite terms like, if only ASEAN could be better coordinated. Now, all this points to the fact that ASEAN is in a good position, which it does not use because it is not well integrated. And Paolo Vergano, who is an old ASEAN friend, who also has, of course, his European experience. And as Juki mentioned just now, he actually has been involved in a regional integration support program by the EU in ASEAN for many years. And he's worked on the ground, he's looked in detail at some of the factors that are holding back greater ASEAN integration, particularly in terms of trade integration, intra-regional trade. And he will actually be focusing on this in his remarks today. Again, we come back to ASEAN selling itself short, not doing what is necessary. And so I think Paolo will begin and speak for about up to half an hour or so. He will begin with some basic data, a very general introduction on economic impact of COVID-19 in EU and ASEAN, but at the same time, then he will dive deep into what ASEAN should be doing in terms of liberalizing its trade. I think he's got a few slides. I think we'll have some good questions to ask, but his main point, I hope, will be very clear at the end of his presentation. So Paolo, can I wish you a very good morning and thank you for joining us from Rome. I'm sure you can't wait to be back in ASEAN, and we can't wait to see you. But good morning, and can the floor is yours, Paolo.
Good morning. Thank you, Tansri Munir, and thank you, of course, to you and to CARI for this opportunity, all the colleagues in CARI for all the work they've put in to organize this. It's a real pleasure, and good morning from Italy to all of you listening and watching out there. As Tansri Munir introduced and mentioned, my plan is to take a snapshot of what's happening, if you will, in terms of some of the contractions during this COVID-19 pandemic, the impact that they're having on trade. I'm a trade lawyer by profession. I've been studying all things trade, both in EU and ASEAN, so I will inevitably then drift towards my turf, so to speak. I'll try to argue that some of the problems of ASEAN, but also some of the opportunities, rest in how ASEAN actually abides by the rules it has given itself, the vision that its leaders had, the purpose that it was set up for, and the ambition that it displays. I think that the economic context to all of this is clear. ASEAN needs to bounce back, as most other countries or groupings around the world, from this pandemic, from the recession that it has triggered. I think if we were to have used my presentation a year back, we could have used exactly the same presentation. We would have titled it, "How can ASEAN bounce forward?" Now it has to bounce back, and it's more important to bounce back than it would have been to bounce forward a year ago. But pretty much the same recipe, at least in my simple trade lawyer's mind, exists. Now, the economic impact is felt by everybody. It's quite dramatic. World trade will likely be down between 13 and 32% in 2020. I start with 3 points, really, as you can see there. ASEAN will no longer be able to depend only on the driver that has been during its inception, and that driver has been extra-ASEAN trade, exports from ASEAN individual member states to the world. And I'll give you some data, some figures in a while. Inevitably, it will have to look more at itself. The opportunity is there, is within the region, and grow that intra-ASEAN trade. To do that, there are some simple policies, simple recipes, I think, within the ambit of the institutional, legal trade policies that are quick grabs and would bring some oxygen to the economy, some much needed oxygen. And finally, the idea that there needs to be more ASEAN integration, less of what we are seeing now in terms of trade restrictions, export bans, new trade investigations for trade remedies, whether it's anti-dumping, countervailing, safeguards. We are seeing a proliferation of those around the region, sometimes targeted to non-ASEAN countries, but clearly there is an instinctive, perhaps even emotional reaction to the pandemic, and that reaction is to protect itself, to close, to look inwards, to block external trade. That has happened in the EU. Yeah, so it's not just an issue we're seeing in ASEAN. The EU has immediately, emotionally reacted, EU member states, at the outset of the pandemic with a bunch of bans as well, banning export of protective equipment. In some countries in the EU, even banning exports of food, grains, other food products. So that was the instinctive reaction. Now we have to think rational. The EU, I think, has been thinking rationally, and all these bans have been lifted. And so we need to look at and see what is ASEAN doing. If we go to the next slide, I will show you some numbers that I think are very relevant. And to me, this is really the one element that we need to keep in mind throughout. In 2018, intra-ASEAN trade, so the trade occurring between and among ASEAN member states within the region, accounted for only 23% of the total trade of ASEAN member states, which means that 77% of trade, of total trade, is done by ASEAN with countries outside of ASEAN. Okay, in some member states, that figure in 2018 was as low as 10%. So only 10% of the trade was with ASEAN brothers and sisters. 90% was with countries outside of ASEAN. Keep in mind that this figure has, in fact, incredibly to me, been decreasing. So intra-ASEAN trade was 25% in 2010. After 8 years of implementation of various agreements meant to increase regional trade, that figure has gone down by essentially 10%. It's gone down to 23%. And that is at a time when ASEAN was increasing its overall exports by 30%. So these numbers to me are staggering, simply inconceivable. There is clearly something wrong there, and that's where I want to focus. If you look at the next slide and we look at the EU data, you can see that in 2018, the average intra-EU trade, so the trade occurring between the then 28 member states of the European Union, was at 69%. Only 2 member states were trading for less than 50% of their total trade with the EU, which means that 26 out of 28 countries were trading more with ourselves within the EU than with third countries. Okay, so intra-EU trade at 69% compared to 23% of ASEAN, a staggering difference. And what I find also incredible is that in the same period that I've shown you for ASEAN, so from 2010 to 2018, EU trade actually increased by 10%. Intra-EU trade increased by 10%. And that's when, at the same time that intra-ASEAN trade decreased by 10%. So to me, these numbers are evidence of a problem within ASEAN, but also an incredible opportunity. If ASEAN were to be able to truly lift all the burdens, the restrictions, the discriminations, the complexities of doing trade within the region, ASEAN would be looking at the potential of growing a pie that is huge. And I think that that is actually the objective of most agreements, most legal instruments within ASEAN, whether it's the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement, whether it's the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2025, and many of the other instruments, they all aim at increasing regional trade, at having a single market within ASEAN where all countries can trade and benefit from increased economic activity. If we go on to the next slide and we ask ourselves what is happening that is impairing this trade to occur, I have 3 lenses of interpretation, and inevitably, of course, I am biased by what I do for a living, by the instruments that I know well, by the policies that I think would bring oxygen to ASEAN as an economic animal. And the first such lens is regulatory transparency. So the transparency of trade-related regulations, legislation, procedures, the things that traders need to know or producers need to know to be able to produce and then sell their products within ASEAN. Now, that transparency is claimed, proclaimed, sought after in abundance in almost every single legal instrument that you will read. Articles 11 and 40 of the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement are very clear. Countries have to notify to each other non-tariff measures before they adopt them, 60 days before they adopt them, so that they can be discussed, they can be streamlined, they can be made proportional to the legitimate objectives they're trying to seek. They're also proclaimed in greater detail in the so-called non-tariff measures guidelines. So the guidelines that ASEAN adopted to implement the obligations in those two articles of the ATIGA. Those two articles were not being implemented. ASEAN felt the necessity to spell out in greater detail how they could be implemented to deliver transparency. And so they adopted the guidelines, which also are not being implemented. And they're now talking about a roadmap to implement the guidelines adopted to bring clarity on how to implement the basic obligations. And this is from 2010 when the ATIGA was adopted. So you can see there is clearly an abundance of rules. But if we look at the numbers in ASEAN, a total of only 180 notifications took place between 2013 and 2018. That's an average of 30 notifications per year. And none of them were notified within the prescribed 60 days of advance notice. So it's a picture, it's a snapshot of abundance of very well drafted, very clear rules, lack of implementation. And the same goes, unfortunately, for another pet project of mine, the ASEAN Trade Repository. I've been working hard on this for the last 8-9 years. This is a repository online that should contain all the rules that are important for traders to know to trade within ASEAN. That repository, 10 years in the making, is largely still empty. And the member states are only doing the work through support being provided by the EU, which is fine. I mean, there are obviously some human resources issues, some funding issues. But to me, really, there is the underlying lack of political will, of the will of complying with the obligations that ASEAN has given itself. These are obligations that member states have undertaken voluntarily. They were not imposed by the WTO or nudged by any development partner. If we compare that with the EU, and that's what I would like to do for the next 3 slides, we can see that the EU has a number of systems to make its rules very transparent. One of them is the so-called Technical Regulation Information Systems, also known as TRIS notification system. Please go back to the previous slide, where the member states of the European Union are supposed to notify 3 months in advance measures that they will adopt, which will have an impact on trade within the region. And there is an average of 700 notifications made every year. In the same period of existence of the ASEAN ATIGA instruments on transparency, the EU has notified tens of thousands of measures vis-a-vis 180 by ASEAN. So there is a clear discrepancy, and I think we need to keep in mind that the EU and ASEAN are different animals. They are different institutional setups. But I think, to me, transparency, regulatory transparency, is a fundamental bedrock on which anything else has to be built. Trade facilitation, reducing the impact of non-tariff measures on trade, removing non-tariff barriers, removing discriminations, removing quantitative restrictions. All of that cannot happen, will struggle to happen if there is no transparency. So transparency is the most important, I think, lens through which we can understand why there is little intra-ASEAN trade compared, for example, to the intra-EU trade that I have indicated earlier. The next slide and the next lens that I would like to apply to my reasoning is that of compliance and enforcement. So I told you the rules are many, the rules are clear, the commitments are sometimes very ambitious in ASEAN. What is a lot less ambitious and a lot less evident is the appetite for member states to actually implement the commitments they have undertaken. And the instruments that ASEAN has given itself to police this degree and rate of implementation are basically twofold. One is an instrument that is a carbon copy of WTO dispute settlement procedures. That's government-to-government dispute settlement. So Malaysia feels that Thailand is impairing its ability to export from Malaysia to Thailand, and some of the measures of Thailand are not consistent with some legal instruments under ASEAN. The government of Malaysia may commence dispute settlement against the government of Thailand within the region. Instead of going to Geneva and doing this under WTO rules, ASEAN would allow this resolution of disputes between member states at a regional level. That's the protocol on enhanced dispute settlement mechanism. It has been already revised twice. It's the third iteration, but it has never been used. It has not even been fully operationalized in that the appellate body has never been established. So the rules are there, never been used in the 10 or so years of functioning of the ATIGA. On the business to government side, a system known as ASEAN Solutions for Investment, Services and Trade, ASSIST, you find it at assist.asean.org, has been set up. It is super simple to use. It's free of charge. It is very direct, and it would enable governments to offer and provide solutions to traders that are experiencing problems on the ground when trading cross-border intra-ASEAN. So exactly the ambit that I was portraying as being insufficiently implemented by countries. Now, that system was launched back in 2016. There have been only 10 cases so far, and only in one instance, arguably, the assist delivered a solution to the complainant. Now here, the problem, of course, is not of governments not standing up to what they have agreed. Here, the problem is of the business within the region not activating the system. The business often complains about a plethora of problems. Yet, when it comes to trying and resolve them, there is a lot of skepticism and, as the figures indicate, very little uptake in trying to uphold those rights. Now, compare that to the EU. And of course, as I said, the EU is a different institutional setup. The EU is a customs union. There is an internal market. There are institutions that have really strong enforcement powers compared to those of the ASEAN Secretariat or of the other ad hoc institutions. But look at some of the numbers. So set aside the role of the European Court of Justice, which is a strong arbiter of cases between EU member states and the European Commission, and between EU citizens or companies and EU member states. So all of that works very well. It has really policed, in a way, the internal market. But if we look at Solvit, which is a system that we can compare to ASSIST in ASEAN, that system went from a mere 38 cases back in 2002 to a staggering number of 2,295 cases in a single year in 2018. And in the same period, when ASSIST was engaging in 10 cases in ASEAN, the EU saw 10,000 cases brought by citizens or companies in the EU against one of the EU governments, with 70% of those, so about 7,000 cases, being resolved within an average of 10 weeks. Now, that is stronger enforcement, stronger compliance of the rules. That gives the reassurance to businesses that if they do business in the EU, or if they were to do business in ASEAN, their investments, their rights, their opportunities to trade would be upheld, would be guaranteed, would be safeguarded. The third lens of interpretation is the third lens of interpretation, please, if I could have the next slide, is that of stakeholders' engagement. Now, why are some of the rules so cumbersome, so difficult to comply with by operators, so completely removed from the realities of trade when adopted by member states within ASEAN? Largely because member states do so in a vacuum. They don't talk sufficiently, they don't engage sufficiently with business. They don't talk to business stakeholders before adopting the rules. Perhaps there are some instruments to address the problems of those rules when they are adopted, but in the legislative making, in the regulatory processes of ASEAN, there is very little opportunity for stakeholders, especially private sector stakeholders, to engage. The instruments are few. The sectoral bodies that allow that engagement are few and not very willing. And there is no accountability. Most of the issues being put forward by business are often neglected or left on the back burner for a long time. Now, recently, the EU has supported ASEAN in launching what is known as the e-platform for consultations with the private sector, where the ASEAN Business Advisory Council and some of the joint business councils of countries and regions that operate within ASEAN would have the ability to engage electronically at any time, transparently, no charges, with those ASEAN sectoral bodies, trying to put issues on the table, engage with them to improve legislation, minimize the costs of regulation and import and export procedures. But that's happening very, very little, and there is very little ability for the private sector to engage and to make its views known and to see then results from the engagement and the discussions. Also, very few so-called regulatory impact assessments are taking place. So ASEAN very, very seldomly looks at what would be the impact of new regulations, the impact on business, the impact on trade. You compare that with the EU, where the process is super structured, perhaps even too much, very transparent, and every single piece of legislation at the regional level would be subject to a legislative roadmap, which is published, the timing being quite structured and available to all. There would be inception and detailed impact assessments, and during those impact assessments, private sector actors, civil society, non-governmental organizations can interact with the regulators, with the legislators. Ex ante and ex post assessments to see, do we need this piece of legislation? Is it necessary? Is it proportional? Or what has the impact been of that legislation? Or the lack of impact of legislation? If some legislation wants to open up trade, like the ATIGA, like the NTM's guidelines, have they made a difference? Yeah. Public hearings before parliaments, before the European Commission, dedicated public consultations with civil society, stakeholders consultations, expert groups, early publication of drafts. And technology is such a helper these days. You know, all of this can be put out transparently, allowing private sector and different stakeholders to interact. So again, when we look at stakeholders engagement, a big difference between what ASEAN does and what the EU does. Now, as I draw to my conclusions, the next slide, please. I think that the recipe, at least in my mind, is quite clear when it comes to the institutional, legal, and trade policies that we need to change. We need more regulatory transparency, but not just proclaimed in a plethora of agreements, actually provided, actually delivered by member states. And the business, the private sector, should request it, should demand it. ASEAN needs greater compliance with an enforcement of the existing rules, the existing obligations, the existing commitments. It is an incredibly ambitious set of instruments and obligations. ASEAN is extremely ambitious when it comes to the agreements, the protocols, the memoranda of understanding, the various tools that it signs up to. Incredibly ambitious. And I don't think ASEAN needs a lot more rules. ASEAN needs to start implementing, and I'm simplifying, of course, but to start implementing the ones it has already given itself. That would go a long way in increasing this intra-ASEAN rate of trade. There needs to be, obviously, more engagement with the private sector, more actionable tools, more accountability in a way. One thing I think that I should note is that ASEAN is now embarking in a review, in a general review of the ATIGA, the ASEAN Trading Goods Agreement. Trading goods remains the bedrock of economic activity around the region. It is there where the biggest opportunities rest and the biggest benefits to bounce back from COVID-19 and from the problems of very little intra-ASEAN trade exist and should be grabbed. So tweaking the ATIGA, making some sensible changes where necessary would be very important. And I hope actually that the private sector, the civil society at large, will play a role in engaging with governments for that to be achieved. So perhaps a bit provocatively, I would say less new legal instruments, less protocols, frameworks, blueprints, roadmaps, constant initiative that sometimes come across as a little bit of a technique to kick the can down the road instead of implementing what is already been agreed, and more implementation of the very good tools that ASEAN already has. To me, and I hope to us, the only real indicator for success would be to increase that pitiful rate of intra-ASEAN trade, which currently stands at 23%, keeps decreasing, and is an indication that ASEAN is not really coming together as a region, is not really creating an internal market, which would be the biggest and easiest and geostrategically also most important delivery on the economic side of the organization. I would stop there. I think I've spoken too much. Hopefully I've been sufficiently clear in some of my thinking, and I look forward to a discussion.
Thank you very much, Paolo. And I see there are a few questions already. And before we come to the first of them, what I would like to say is your reference to the ATIGA review. There's also supposed to be a midterm review of the ASEAN Economic Community 2025 blueprint, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, in the intervening period, because of COVID-19, the business community, not just the ASEAN business community, but the joint business councils and so on, we have got together to ask ASEAN to set up a high-level special commission to cut through the many knotted problems and layers of decision-making that actually sort of inhibits movement we are pushing hard, and we hope we can succeed. And if such a commission was set up, it will just be like beneath the ASEAN leaders, and they will comprise the right-hand men of the ASEAN leaders. And therefore, what they can do in ASEAN and in their own national jurisdictions would be more powerful than what officials and working groups and what have you have been doing, sometimes running around in circles. There is an attempt, there's an attempt nonetheless. But there's a question that has come from our dear friend, who you know very well from the EU-ASEAN Business Council, Chris Humphreys, is related to this. What does ASEAN have to do to ensure the opportunity for advancement and economic integration and development that this pandemic does present is not missed? And of course, he makes a rather snide remark about, or do you think your presentation will be used again next year? The same one. Okay, Paolo, have a go at it.
Thank you, Tan Sri, and thank you, Chris, for your question. I think perhaps one thing I forgot to say is that I actually don't speak here on behalf of anybody, if you will, certainly not of the EU. I'm very passionate about ASEAN. I've been working with ASEAN since 2006. So I think I have a bit of historical memory, and sometimes I think my way of expressing feelings about ASEAN testifies to the frustration I prove. I think it's the frustration of people like Chris or people like you, Tan Sri, in seeing the opportunities that ASEAN would provide and seeing them largely going missed year after year. So ASEAN remains a fantastic construction, and it has delivered peace around the region, increased economic development, but I think it can do so much more. And I think if ASEAN member states primarily, the leaders, but also the echelons below that, where often then things start to become to slow down, were to realize it, and perhaps the pain of COVID-19 would be the sparkle to ignite that process, then I think ASEAN has really good opportunities for us not to be here next year again talking about removing NTBs, streamlining NTMs, providing more transparency, seeing a little bit of change there. So I think the pain, unfortunately, of this recession, of the slowdown in international trade, should refocus the minds of the leaders. I think the institutional suggestion that ABAC has made to me is very fitting, is very important, because in ASEAN things still come from the top down. That needs to happen. I think the 6 short-term priority measures that ABAC has suggested to the leaders, I read through, aside of those that are immediately health-related, but eliminating NTBs and minimizing NTMs. We've been talking about this for 10 years. ASEAN itself knows it. The leaders keep calling for it. Let's look at that high level at a few very specific things that could be done to actually make a difference. I could go on for hours on this, but notifications of new measures, some of which may be disproportionate NTMs or barriers. Let's make it happen. Let's shift the burden of proof. If a country does not notify, it will be assumed that the measure is illegal, and the country will have to prove that it is legal. There are very simple things that can be done to actually give some teeth to ASEAN. ASEAN is toothless. If a member state does not comply with its requirements, it always gets away with it. This doesn't happen at the WTO. It doesn't happen in the EU, of course, where there's a great degree of enforcement. So my recommendation would be to ensure that some changes are brought. At the high level, there needs to be an indication of what is not working. Privately, nobody needs to be ashamed, but I think somebody has to have a serious conversation with the leaders, with the key decision makers about what is working, what is not working in ASEAN, and then the solutions can be found, and there's plenty.
But Paolo,
Yeah.
I mean, there is another block of questions coming up. But before we come to those questions, I'd like to refer you to your comment, and which is a comment that is very frequently made, of course, a lack of political will. Yeah, the lack of political will. Now, the lack of political will means that you don't really want to do it, or you're not particularly focused on doing it. I think there's a bit of both. They're not focused on wanting to do it, and don't really want to do it. And this lack of political will, for example, is even evident. You talked about engagement with stakeholders, which they do engage. We spend a lot of our free time, writing reports, having so-called dialogues and what have you, and which turn out to be a lovely photo-taking opportunity, and something of a charade. So there is an engagement with stakeholders, but it is a bit of a charade. It's almost like something to cover up for that lack of political will, which I come to. The lack of political will is you are not focused, or you do not want to do it. Now, question is, for example, people talk about Indonesia, huge in its own right, in its own self, attracting a heck of a lot of American investments now, from the relocation that's taking place. And therefore, why should it bother more about ASEAN integration than attracting those American relocated investments? Or you take Vietnam, a population of 96 million, just signed an FTA, which is coming into force in, I think, August, with the EU. 96 million, FTA with the EU, Chinese relocated investments coming in, relocated investments from China coming into Vietnam, 71% duty-free exports to the EU. Why should it worry about ASEAN? So it all adds up to lack of focus, lack of political will, and priorities. Now, how can this be broken up and made into, look, we can have a bigger market, we can have shorter supply chains, we can generate greater growth, and so on. How can you shake it up? Like Chris was saying, how can you shake it up? How can you make it happen? Because there's so many different types of considerations that are coming into individual ASEAN member states thinking about their future economies.
Yeah. Look, I think that there is an element of competition always between and among member states to regional organization. We have that in Europe, even in Europe, where we have an internal market with no borders, no regulatory differences, perfect degree of trade facilitation. There is still competition between Germany and France and Italy and Spain. It's normal. ASEAN has too much of that competition. ASEAN member states are competing with each other a great deal. And I think that's partly because they're still leaning towards the outer world more than they lean towards ASEAN economically, from a trade perspective. The number I've shown, 23% of intra-ASEAN trade is, to me, the revealing evidence. Now, that needs to change. I think it may probably change because of COVID triggering a decrease in exports, perhaps also a decrease in investment. I haven't looked at the figures and I'm not really an economist, but I would imagine that even just the inability to travel around would deter many that would have invested in ASEAN to actually invest in ASEAN. There is a lot of onshoring, nearshoring happening, and so a lot of the productions may go away from China, and yes, some of them may be repositioned in ASEAN, but some of them may go back to the US, to the EU, and so on and forth. So ASEAN needs to really understand, I think, at the highest levels first, that ASEAN itself is the most important market to develop. It's the easiest. It's the most promising. If that happens, there will be, I hope, less hurdles less burdensome procedures, more trade facilitation, more transparency for ASEAN to come together and to grow the internal pie. I only see that as an opportunity. Of course, there will be some frictions. There will be some countries that are better off, others that will need to be assisted. We have that in Europe as well, but it can be managed. And really, the opportunities are much more than the risks, I think.
Okay. I think, thank you, Paolo. I think we have just forwarded you some questions, and there are a couple that relate to EU-ASEAN collaboration. One about the reopening of EU borders. Are there areas ASEAN businesses should take note of moving forward to expedite inter-regional trade? The other one, more broadly, what are the potential new collaborative opportunities you foresee EU-ASEAN as we move towards post-pandemic recovery, and special reference to the European Green Deal? Can you address these two questions, please?
Yeah, no, they're huge questions, of course. Perhaps I can try to narrow it down and zoom into an area that I know very well, and I think it's an area where a lot of opportunities actually exist and could be reaped. That is the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. So as you know, there is a big push in the EU. Partly it is a genuine push coming from civil society, from citizens, consumers, to ensure that trade is more sustainable, that production is more sustainable, that there is no deforestation, that there is less CO2 emissions, all of that. That's partly coming from a genuine interest of consumers. Partly, sometimes it is conveniently used to hide some protectionist policies in it. And the EU, as all other countries, I think knows how to play that game. All countries do, actually. My point would be, and I can give you an example of an industry, a sector that I know extremely well, and it is very important for ASEAN, particularly for countries like Indonesia and Malaysia: palm oil. Okay, clearly the EU still needs palm oil. The world needs palm oil, but palm oil is becoming, fortunately, in the EU, an easy target to all sorts of accusations. Sometimes it actually doesn't do much to offset them. If we look at that particular product or commodity and we say, what could the EU and ASEAN do to improve relations and to base them on science, base them on facts, base them on trade facilitative solutions, but also base them on solutions that deliver sustainability, environmental protection. Now, the way to do it is not to do it unilaterally, not for the EU to impose its unilateral standards on producing countries, but to engage with producing countries, not to take each other to the WTO. Those are useful instruments, of course, because the rules exist. They should be abided by. But I think if we look just at that specific example, I would say, let's sit down between the two blocks within the scope of trade and sustainable development, look at a multilateral or a region-to-region standard on what is sustainable palm oil, that here's the issues, the problems, the needs of producing countries and the wishes of consumers, companies, regulators in destination countries, and work out a standard which would enable trade, which would not allow punitive scapegoat type of regulations that discriminate one commodity against others. So I think there needs to be more talk, there needs to be more engagement, there needs to be a higher degree of sophistication also from ASEAN in using the existing instruments to try and avoid disputes, facilitate trade, and also secure some non-trade concerns, which are becoming very important. The environment, sustainability, those are clearly important fronts. So I would say, yes, those are probably the recipes: more engagement, more discussions, maybe one day even this region-to-region agreement. I'm personally a bit skeptical about it, because I think that, again, ASEAN member states are still competing with each other more than they're willing to sit down as a bloc and negotiate with the EU. There are some political issues, of course. Probably the EU also enjoys the fact that by negotiating with one country at a time, it can extract a lot more concessions than it would if it were to negotiate with a single bloc. So there are a number of issues involved, but the idea of a bloc to bloc, I think, remains attractive and should over time be facilitated and nurtured technically for it to be achievable.
Thank you. We have about 7 minutes now, and I think there are some questions relating to the UK.
Yeah.
We've sent them on to you. Perhaps you could dispose of them first before we come back to this issue of EU-ASEAN collaboration. What can happen, if you will.
Yeah, so with respect to the UK, I think still rationally and economically thinking, I have never understood the move. I think it was driven by certainly non-economic factors, and I'm still, as a European citizen, deeply sorry. I respect the choice of the UK, of course, but I'm sorry that they're leaving. I think the EU will lose, the UK will lose. That figure that I gave you, intra-EU trade, of course, will go down with the UK leaving. The UK will lose that market. 69% intra-EU trade. They will lose access to that incredible market. So, of course, they'll be looking at other partners. Of course, they have to get some preferential treatment elsewhere for their products. And ASEAN, you know, the CP, TPP, potentially the RCEP, they're all easy to grab opportunities. The problem is that there is nothing easy in this world when it comes to negotiating bilateral deals. Either a country gives up on almost everything, and that's an easy negotiation for the counterpart, or if it wants to put forward and pursue some economic objectives, it will take time. So I don't see this happening quickly for the UK. I think ASEAN stands to have some good cards to play at the table of negotiations with the UK. The UK is an important market, it's a vibrant country. So ASEAN should be prepared to negotiate well with the UK and get a foothold on that market. But it won't be easy, it won't be fast.
All right, thank you. Joki, is there any other burning questions that you see or hands that are being raised? I don't see any. Do you? Joki?
Well, actually, I think Chris is still online, and he may have further questions. But other than that, I think all the questions that are already in the chat box have already been addressed. So.
Okay, if Chris is online, I mean, we can't wait for him. He might be online with something else.
No, he's happy to. So if we can just, I think he has a question or two. Chris.
Thanks, Juki. Thanks, Tanshri, and thank you, Paolo. It's been a very interesting session. Just following up actually on something that Tanshri was saying earlier about political will. I think we all agree, if you read the AEC blueprints and the other various agreements, it fills you with great heart and cheer that the region wants to drive ahead with economic integration and understands the benefits that would flow from that for ASEAN in its trading relationship with the rest of the world and amongst themselves. But some of us get a feeling the success ASEAN's had in attracting FDI in particular in recent years has made the leaders very complacent. They seem to think that things are coming to them. So that's one view. The other view is, I think, also the ASEAN member states just aren't interested in economic integration. They are too busy sorting out their own stuff. I mean, which side of the camp do you sit on with that, or do you think both things are very true?
As you say, I think ASEAN has had it too good, and that's credit to ASEAN actually, and to individual ASEAN member states. If they've been performing well, maybe not for all, but certainly for large parts of their economies and and industries, I think it's credit to what they have done. They need to sustain that growth, and I am afraid that because of COVID, because of some of the signals we had seen even before COVID, it's going to be difficult to sustain that degree of growth. And I hope that within closed walls, not in an environment where anybody needs to be ashamed or scorecarded, the leaders and the key industry players and the key stakeholders can have a discussion and say, where do we go from now? How do we fulfill the many objectives and ambitions that are written everywhere? Just read the AEC Blueprint 2025. It's fantastic. I hope it doesn't remain science fiction for the most part, but it's all written there. We don't need new recipes. There needs to be a system, and there needs to be a realization that a lot of this stuff needs to be actually implemented. If it is implemented as it is written, ASEAN will not have a problem. It's all there already. So there needs to be some mechanism, and what ABAC has suggested perhaps is that seed being planted, a mechanism to hold accountable the states, ultimately the leaders, the officials, the private sector of ASEAN, to actually do what they're saying they want to do. It's as simple as that to me. I know that, the political will is a big thing, but perhaps COVID will help that political will to come together.
Hope so. We all hope so indeed. I mean, I have said and written many times that, ASEAN is very happy with its future prospect. It's less involved with its current reality, but future prospect is not current reality. But then it still gets these investments like Chris mentions, and it's quite happy. So ASEAN's happy to be suboptimal, it doesn't want to be optimal. So these are the kinds of things that also operate apart from lack of political will. But we are very clear from what you say, from how you have made your presentation today, what ASEAN must do.
Also, Tansri, one element, but the problem with that approach is that investments come and go. Just as quickly as they have been made, they can be withdrawn. That I think is what ASEAN needs to be worried about. Look at China. Onshoring, nearshoring out of China, for China must be terrible. But if ASEAN doesn't have that existing alternative, China partly has it because it can export elsewhere and it has a huge internal market. ASEAN doesn't. ASEAN needs to be prepared that if one day something else happens and investments dry up or are moved out of ASEAN, ASEAN doesn't really find itself in trouble.
Yes, excellent point. It's very happy with getting those investments. I mean, America still, invests. There are more than 3 times American investments in ASEAN than there are in China. And everyone's been talking about, American investments in China, for example. So ASEAN's too happy, being suboptimal, and it's going to be caught with its trousers down at some point. If it doesn't.
The analogy is perfect.
But it's quite clear from what you say what ASEAN must do. But I wonder, just to end, what are the prospects of greater ASEAN-EU collaboration? ASEAN-EU FTA, can that happen? And therefore make it ASEAN's look at itself as one unit, dealing with another regional grouping. What is the future of that relationship, and how would it help ASEAN as much as EU?
I personally think that the future is very rosy. The EU remains probably the only real grouping that is serious about the benefits of multilateral engagement, continues to look at ASEAN and invest in ASEAN and cooperate in ASEAN like no other trading and economic partner. So I think I am not worried at all about that relationship remaining strong. I think the region-to-region FTA, I don't really see it happening soon. And as I said, I think it's partly because of ASEAN. Member states are still competing for that privileged access into the EU among each other rather than wanting to have it as a region. So it is counterintuitive for a country like Singapore or Vietnam that now have preferential access into the EU to allow their ASEAN competitors to gain the same. So I struggle to actually, and beyond the rhetoric of this, which would be fantastic region to region, but I struggle to see that happening technically and strategically. But I think that relationship will remain strong.
All right. So we are conquered without having EU to be dividing and conquering us. We are conquered already, at the other end. But we are running out of time. And I think, there's been a very rich, informative, and quite sharp, incisive session about, how we what we must do in ASEAN. But we know that, and thank you for the specifics you've given in terms of regulatory transparency, in terms of stronger enforcement, in terms of stakeholder engagement, economic assessment studies, and so on, of regulations. Thank you very much for spending your time with us, and we hope to see you soon in person.
Yes, likewise.
In these parts of the world. And let me also thank everyone else for being present and asking questions. And till I think we have another session to come on the 3rd of July, which probably Juki wants to say something about. But from us, from me and from Paolo, can I say thank you, Paolo, and goodbye, everyone. And Juki?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you, Tan Sri. Yes, it's true. Let me just remind everyone that we have another session coming up next week, which is on the 3rd of July. We're very privileged to have the Secretary General of ASEAN, His Excellency Dr. Paduka Lim Chok Hoi, who will be spending some time with us and talk to us about the issues that we've discussed and probably what ASEAN is doing for COVID-19, and probably can address some of the questions or issues that we raised just now about political will and etc. So be sure to join us next week, July the 3rd, 3 to 4 p.m. You can RSVP via the link that we've already shared or via the QR code, which I know that it's not off the screen, but we hope to have your participation next week. So with that, we thank you for spending the past 1 hour with us, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.
All right. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Take care.